So our final talk for this week on our Patient Safety Week is presented to us by Simon Flemming. He's a Trauma and Orthopaedics Registrar, Vice Chair of the Academy of Medical Royal College's Trainees Doctors Group, a past President of British Orthopaedic Trainees Associate and Co-Chair of the International Conference in Residency Education. I've totally not said it all enough, but he's passionate about orthopedics and advocating for diversity and equality in healthcare, and he's delivered several TED Talks on the subject. And he's here with us today to talk to us about patient safety and about how it applies to us in the pediatric realm. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Don't worry about the bio. I absolutely hate bios. The creepiest thing in the world is having to write about yourself in the third person. Like, Simon's a Leo and likes long walks on the beach. So for me, the thing that I'm most involved in really is around culture change, and the reason why changing our culture will change the way we care for our patients. From my point of view, that I've just always hated bullies. When I was at school, I was just the gobby Jewish kid with an opinion, and the only thing that really changed was that I got a training number, and I always wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. From the moment I was exposed to it in medical school, I kind of got that feeling that they were my kind of people. They were all about fixing stuff. They were all about teamwork. They always seemed to be quite happy, though some would argue that that's because ignorance is bliss. But it was something that I really wanted to do. And so when I got my training number, I joined the British Orthopaedic Trainee Association. And the more orthopedics I did, the more I felt that every now and then there were these moments that just felt wrong to me. They felt uncomfortable. They felt, like someone playing a wrong note in a song, and you kind of... And the problem was that, to be fair, like any organization, whenever we would say something, we would always be accused of living in an ivory tower, right? BOTA gets it, the BMA gets it, any organization, especially one that contains trainees, is often accused of it. You're a self-selecting, self-aggrandizing, whatever. So we did that thing that orthopedic surgeons are famous for, and we reflected. And what we realized is, actually, you know what? People were probably right. People fed into us as an organization, and I would therefore be able to speak on behalf of our members and be well informed. But there was an argument that, did I really have the right to express an opinion and suggest that I could speak on behalf of a person of color who also identified as queer, who had a child who was about to go on fellowship and had an exam to do? Do I, as Mr. white male privilege, have that right? So we kind of felt that with great power comes great responsibility, and so we did something called the BOTA census. This was back in 2015, and we looked at the GMC survey, and I'm sure you all know that the biggest issues with the GMC survey are that it ignores small numbers, n equals less than, which means small hospitals and small specialties get sidelined. But also, and this was the bit that made us uncomfortable, if you want to raise concerns, you give up your anonymity. So the moment you want to say, I'm experiencing poor training, or my boss is sexually harassing me, or whatever you want to say, at that stage you have to give up your anonymity, at which point, unsurprisingly, they then take your now non-anonymized info and give it to your boss. So unsurprisingly, we felt that maybe the GMC survey wasn't the best way to answer some of the questions we wanted to ask. So we made a couple of promises as an organization. We promised that we would keep all the data anonymous, and we literally said, we will give up our training numbers before we reveal who you are, where you are, what's going on. And we promised that we would do something about whatever we found, because again, we looked at some of the other surveys and recognized that often they have to wait 2 or 3 years to show a pattern. And of course, if you wait 2 or 3 years to act on a report of, say, bad training or bullying or what have you, that's anywhere from, 2 or 3 to 6 to 12 generations of trainees moving through that hospital. So we started to build the survey, and as we were building it, I was vice president at the time, and I said, look, I'd really like to put in a thing about culture. There's some stuff, it just doesn't sit right with me. And at the time, the committee were like, look, if this is the hill you want to die on, fine. So they were asking questions about demographics and career planning and training, and I designed a section around culture, in particular around bullying, undermining, and harassment. And those are pretty emotive terms. So we kind of gave some definitions. So for me, bullying is about power and about silence. It's that classic thing of, Merritt, I want you to come on a ward round with me. And you say, well, you know what? I'd love to come on the ward round, but I was meant to go home 36 hours ago, and I'd really like to get some sleep now. And I say, that's fine. You can either come on the ward round, or we can just not sign off your final paperwork before ARCP. Like, it's entirely up to you, but it's a choice you have to make. And realistically, it's not a choice. I just flex my muscles from a boss point of view or a power point of view, and someone does what I want. Undermining's different. Undermining's more subtle. Undermining is about making people feel small and worthless and undervalued. Undermining is, the classic medical student thing is, back in my day, we learned anatomy, but now medical students, you're all idiots. Undermining are those little jibes where someone says, well, pediatrics easy, they're just little adults anyway, it's a joke. All you have to do is bake and be jolly, and it's a, and then undermining often leads into that final category, harassment, discrimination. Interestingly, it's the only bit that's actually protected in law, and those are your protected characteristics. That's age, sex, gender, race, etc. So that's where the comments go from, pediatrics is easy to, well, it's mostly a female specialty, basically, it's for women because they can't stand up, and anyway, you just want to go and have kids. That's illegal. And what we did was we asked 2 questions. We said, in the last 4 weeks, have you, in orthopedics, directly experienced bullying, undermining, or harassment? And then we said, have you ever, in your time in orthopedics, witnessed these things? And there was a lot of to and fro about that. But what we know now, and what we knew then, to be fair, is that perception is a huge part of changing culture. And it's all well and good if I'm in theatres and I'm working with the boss, and the boss tells me to man the fuck up, stop being such a pussy. And I laugh and he laughs and we fist bump and it's all great. And what we don't realise is that there is a medical student or an F1, F2 in the corner of the room, and they're watching this. And realistically, one of 2 things goes through their minds. Either, what a toxic group, what a awful bunch of human beings. I want no part of that, and orthopods are just terrible people. Or they watch and they go, oh, that's how I fit in. That must be how I have to speak and behave. That's the, and I hate this word, banter. So we had to ask about perception. And so we got this data back, and it's what one of my colleagues calls my professional oh shit moment, because the data was off the charts, as one might expect. So about 70-something% reported either experiencing or witnessing these behaviors. And we had the data from the NHS staff survey, which year on year shows a 25% rate of bullying, undermining, and harassment. Remembering that that's about 300,000, 350,000 people within the NHS, and that's of the people who fill out the survey. And so we had this data, and what did I do with it? Well, at the time, I was obsessed with data, as all trainees are, and BOTA has this session at the British Orthopaedic Association our parent organization's conference. And normally it's quaint, and Bota would stand up and present an audit about what color shoes people wear on Thursdays, and everyone would go like that, and then you'd go away. But we had this data, and this work had never been done before, really anywhere. And so we started a whispering campaign. We would wander around the conference and talk loudly in hushed tones about the amazing data that the trainees had. You've got to come to room 104 tomorrow. You're not going to believe what they're presenting. What's it about? I don't know, but it sounds awesome. And so we get to the room, and it's standing room only. And not only is it standing room only, but there are some big dogs in the room. Every president of every orthopedic society from around the world, the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, the Indians, the Chinese, they're all there. Plus the president of the college, plus, they're all there. And my colleague, my friend, the president, presents his stuff. And then he goes, and now Mr. Flemming will present some other data. And he literally walks to the very edge of the stage. So I walk to the front of the stage. I allow for a little bit of dramatic pause. And I say, I'm a bully. I make people feel small. I've probably broken employment law. And statistically, most people in this room have too. And we must do better. And then I present the data. And at the end of this talk, I imagined it was going to be like one of those movies where there's silence in an auditorium or something, and then someone starts a slow clap, and then everyone starts a slow clap, and then the credits roll. But that's not what happened. Instead, everyone lost their minds. People wanted to know who was doing what, where was it happening, where they wanted to blame someone. Was my rotation this? Was my rotation that? This is all lies. We want to see more detail about your methodology. And it was fascinating because at one point, an eminent professor stood up and the room went silent. And he goes, Simon, you know I take care of my boys. You should note that all of his trainees are boys, regardless of sex or gender, at least in his mind. You know I take care of my boys. And I ask them at the end of every year, I say, you all right? And they go, yeah. But they tell me if this stuff was going on. And I said, well, yeah, I know you do that. But I wonder, how would you respond if a trainee, a senior trainee, were to say to you, you know what, Prof, sometimes your behaviors they're kind of like bullying. And there was this pause in the room, and he leans in and he goes, well, I would tell them to shut their fucking mouth. At which point, everyone loses their minds again. So we went away and we developed the Hammer It Out campaign. We felt that we had a duty to challenge these behaviors, to call them out in a way that was constructive rather than that sort of call out culture of just pointing at stuff and then running away, to raise awareness, to start a dialogue, to make it the top of everyone's agenda. The GMC, the BMA, the colleges, the academy, you name it, we wanted them talking about it. But we couldn't work out why we were getting pushback. It seemed like such a common sense campaign. You know, our campaign was, these behaviors are bad. We know that they're bad, and here's the evidence for it. Now, for those of you that don't know the evidence per se, we know that these behaviors affect patient care. We know this to be true. So, for example, there was a paper now 18 months ago that showed that bullying cost the NHS about £2.5 billion a year. We know that if you are rude or incivil to someone at work, about 80% of recipients of that behavior will spend time that they should be working worrying about what just happened. But more than that, and this is where we get into the kind of patient safety angle, we know that if you do these behaviors, if you bully someone or undermine someone or harass or discriminate against someone at work, about 38% of people will reduce the quality of their work because of those behaviors. About 48% of those will reduce their time at work. 25% will take it out on patients. And here's the bit that we didn't really know when we asked the questions. If you witness these behaviors, if you're on the other side of the room and you see me ripping someone apart, the person witnessing those behaviors will get a 20% decrease in their performance and a 50% decrease in their willingness to help others. So we thought this is a win. This is easy. We've got an obvious patient safety argument and we've got an obvious cost argument. Job done. But actually that wasn't what happened. We were getting pushback. I couldn't work out why. And then I thought about it from a parenting point of view. So most people have a parent or parents, and that parent or parents wants you to do well. They love you. When you're good, they reward you. When they're bad, they punish you. Day to day, life goes on, but they want to see you succeed. They come from a good place. Some parents are better than others, some harsher, some softer. And then about 25, 30 years ago, the world was informed that if you hit your child, if you smack them, it's child abuse. To hit your child is to neglect. It makes you a bad person. And so the world reflected on this and went, you can't tell me how to parent my child. I'm a good parent. I love my kids. Sometimes they're bad and you know what? They stop being bad. It's how I was parented. And then they paused and then they went, are you saying I was abused? That grandma was an abuser? How dare you? And we realized that that had been to an extent what we'd been saying. That these behaviors that obviously impact on patient care and cost the NHS money were the fault of those people and the way they've been raised. They heard it as an attack and as blame. And that's what we've been doing. Mea culpa, it's what we've been doing. And what we had to realize and what we had to start saying was, no, we want to be like you. I want to be the kind of consultant you are and the kind of training you are. But there are some tweaks. We know we can do better. And what was fascinating was we encountered this spectrum of people who responded to that message. And it is the bell curve of humanity. On one end, you have the villains, the people who got into training because it begets power and prestige and influence. They enjoy making people feel small. Those people sort of need to retire or die. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, and they're fascinating. They're the angels, and they are nearly as hard as the villains. Because when you speak to them, when you go to their unit, when you go to their department and you tell them these stories, they will say to you, no, these behaviors don't exist. There is no bullying in my specialty, my hospital, my region. There is no sexism in surgery. I've never seen it. I won't tolerate it. So I tell them this story and I share it with you with permission. A colleague of mine was published in a journal, and this journal puts pictures of the authors next to the byline so that you can put a name to a face if you bump into them at a conference. She was very proud of her paper. It's a good paper. And she was walking down the corridor when she was stopped by a professor. And this professor said, oh, could I have a word? Yes, prof. I saw your piece in the journal. Yes, prof. And here's the thing. Back in the olden days, we didn't have to hire women. And at least when we did have to hire them, we could hire the pretty ones. The only thing worse than seeing your ugly face at work is having to see your ugly face on my coffee table. At which point he was dragged away by his fellow and words were had. Now I tell this story and there are a proportion of people who do not believe it to be true. The majority can imagine it. They know that one person who would say that, who would behave like that. They've met them, they've worked with them, they've seen them from the other side of the room. I use this story when I speak to the angels and I say, I am not lying, I bet my GMC number on it. You have to get your head around the fact that this sort of stuff happens. And then you've got the middle of the bell curve. The middle of the bell curve is everyone else. They have good days and bad days. They have good behaviors and bad behaviors. Sometimes they make mistakes, sometimes they don't. The example I give there is one of the best trainers I ever worked for. And some medical students came up to me and said, oh, Mr. Flemming, we're going to report Mr. So-and-so as a racist. And I was shocked. No, you can't do that. He's my boss and he's really good. And they said, no, he's really not. He's profoundly racist. And I said, well, can you explain it to me? And they said, watch him in the morning meeting, in the theatre meeting. Okay. So I reflected on where my biases lay and I was like, right, I've missed something, but what's going on with the boss? And then I watched him, and every time we were in the list with a particular scrub nurse, he would impersonate her Afro-Caribbean accent. And I hadn't noticed, right? Like I said, Mr. White Male Privilege. I hadn't picked up on it. And so I went back to the medical students and I was like, Jesus, can I speak to him about this? And they said, yeah, that's what we want. We just didn't know who to speak to, so we were going to go to the medical school. So I approached this boss, this trainer, who is one of my role models, and I said, this is what's happening, this is what's going on. And he said, look, I'm not a racist. I've known her since I was a house officer. She's the godmother to my children. She's round my house every weekend. Like, her kids and my kids go to school together, blah, blah, blah. I'm not a racist. I said, yeah, but that's not what they see. You're at work in a position of power and you are behaving in this way. And he goes, but at the house, she calls me this, that, and I, yeah, but that's not what people see. And he was mortified. No one in 20-something years of practice had ever suggested to him that that behavior was unacceptable. And he'd never considered it might be, because that blurring of lines between work and home and work and friends and work and family. The other pushback that I got a lot of is, well, we are stressed. We work in a high stress environment. And I actually thought about that and I thought, yeah, no, that's not unreasonable actually. And then I thought about it a bit more. And when I do this as a workshop, I now do a graph of stress to behavior. And I say, okay, on this graph, can you pinpoint to me how stressed you have to be before homophobia becomes acceptable? And the room goes, oh, I think you're being facetious. I go, no, okay, fine. Well, look, here's a trauma call. And during trauma calls, I hate women. That's okay, right? Because I'm stressed. And then obviously when my stress goes down, I'm not allowed to hate women anymore, right? And they go, well, no, we just mean that, we're stressed. And you go, no, I get it. But if you speak to our colleagues in the military, our colleagues in the police force, our colleagues in a lot of other very high stress environments, they will say that that was what was said to them until eventually people pointed out that actually, from a human factors point of view, if we flip it on its head and we change our culture, our stress gets less. And I realized that I couldn't suddenly make it just about orthopedics, and I couldn't suddenly just make it about individuals. And this was when other specialties came out the woodwork: general surgery, pediatrics, all of these specialties come out of the woodwork and said, we have similar problems, we have similar issues. And it's fascinating. I was in Canada and I was doing some work in a pediatric unit of some repute, this kind of talk. And I said, I can't imagine a world where pediatric trainees are bullied. You guys are so nice. You're all so lovely. You know, when I bring you in and I ask for help, you're always so helpful. And this trainee said, well, last night, one of the pediatric cardiology consultants, attendings, came down to our handover and said, before everyone goes, we just need to debrief about last night. And they pointed to the senior registrar who was on the night before. And they said, so I guess you need to tell the room about why you killed a baby last night. And I heard this story and my jaw hit the floor and they were like, yeah. I was like, okay, wow. And that's when, I'm sure you noticed, the questions started turning up in the GMC survey and all these other surveys. And what we found was it was everywhere. So suddenly it becomes a culture change project. And so I started to look at what we would want, what we would look for, what we would aspire to. And I started to look at things like smoking cessation. And I started to look at things like drink driving. So what did we call drink driving 20, 30 years ago? Well, it was just driving. Have one for the road. My dad, who is a doctor, talks about driving home so drunk that his boss was having to work the pedals with his hands because my dad could only steer. And that was normal. That was lads, lads, lads. That was the culture. Now, if after my talk you feel like, Jesus, I need a drink, and you go to the pub and you see off a bottle of wine or two, and then you reach for your car keys, someone will intervene. It won't necessarily be your friend. It might be the waiter. It might be the person on the door. It might be a complete stranger on the other table. But can I get you an Uber? Are you sure you're safe to drive? That's the culture we need to get to, where it is normalized to challenge these behaviors and abnormal to do them. There's no mention of tickets or the police. There's no pejorativeness. There's no blame. It's just, here's the thing. Do you want to maybe not do that? That's not how we do things here. We're not there yet. We're not in healthcare. We're at the stage where we're having that conversation. But that conversation is difficult because we know that these behaviors link to patient safety. We know they cause patient harm. We know they cause physician harm. We know they impact on recruitment and retention. But often that's not what people want to hear when you want to challenge their behaviors. Because in the heat of the moment, you're going, well, actually, interestingly, we've lost half of our nursing staff and 3 of our SHOs because of these behaviors. They don't care. And that's why I generally espouse the Vanderbilt cup of coffee model. If you don't know it, I would recommend you read about it, look it up. It's great. Because what it says is, if someone behaves in this way, if you go somewhere, not your office, not their office, not a corridor, and you have a cup of coffee or similar with them, and you have a discussion with them, you reflect back to them what went on, not in a blamey way, just in a, this happened, this is maybe how you made me or someone else feel. They won't like it. You might have to have a bit of a discourse. It might not be an easy conversation, but statistically, they will change their behaviors. What Vanderbilt then showed was that if they don't, you need to have an escalation policy, and it needs to be stuck to rigidly. And interestingly, their escalation policy was basically a cup of coffee, followed by my friends now call it the there's no coffee conversation. So that's normally in an office, far more serious, normally with a conversation around some form of remedial training. Then you have another level. That is where you are formally reprimanded and there are some important people in the room. And the final level, the tip of the triangle, is when the most important person in the room says, stop doing what you're doing or I'll fire you. This is your final warning. You've had 3 shots, a cup of coffee, a no cup of coffee. You've been on the courses. Stop it. And what they found in their research, and they did tens of thousands of these conversations, is that there were about 80 people 80, who didn't change their behaviors following all these interventions, right? It's not me, it's them. It's not me, it's them. It's not me, it's them. Multiple times. And of those 80, 20 people, 20 had some sort of intracranial pathology, either a tumor or undiagnosed psychiatric illness. Because if someone is unwilling to change in the face of these recurrent interventions, there is something going on. These conversations can't always be had by us. Sometimes the power gradient is just too much, too steep, too hard. And that's why you need allies. That's why you need people to go to where you go, just as the medical students did with me, I might go to a more senior registrar or the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian or another consultant and go, look, this conversation needs to be had. I'm not in a position to have it. But can you do it, please? Can you raise these issues? Because we know that it causes patient harm. We know that it causes the NHS harm. But we also know that there are systematic and systems problems. So there's a balance to be found between putting all the responsibility on the individual and simultaneously trying to change the system. And you have to kind of do a bit of both, because the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. So some of us will have the privilege and ability to impact systems. We will have influence and power and privilege. And some, like me, are just trainees going about their business, causing a little bit of trouble now and then. But you still have the ability to change things. And the way we think about it, the way it works is you start to role model those behaviors. I've done it, and it sounds like parenting again. I've started saying please and thank you more. I've started apologizing when I am inevitably a dick at work, when I am tired, when I put my foot in it, when I say something stupid. And I say it, and I mean it, and we learn from it. And what you find, and it happened to me, is you hear things like, all the medical students want to be in orthopedic clinic today, and I don't know why. Or why is it that the staff want to be in Simon's theatre but not so-and-so's theatre? And then you start to see other people role modeling those behaviors. There's evidence that it takes about 7 weeks for people to pick up on those unconscious cues. And so you start to change yourself a little bit, and then you start to change your department. Just little changes, thinking about things, reflecting on things before or after you say them. And so you start to change your department, and because we as trainees are this itinerant workforce, we move around. As we move from hospital to hospital, department to department, we start to change hospitals. Because you move to hospital X, you do your thing, then you move to hospital Y, you do your thing, and suddenly those departments are better for having you there. And obviously, if you start to change hospitals, by definition, you are going to start to change your specialty. And if you can change your specialty, and we know that all these behaviors have direct correlations to patient care and patient safety, you can undeniably start to change healthcare. And because we know that the NHS is the 5th largest employer in the world after a couple of armies and Walmart, and we know that pretty much everyone in this country will engage in the NHS at some stage or another, if you can change healthcare, you can actually change the way people behave with patients around the world. And it all starts with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Simon. That was really very insightful talk, and I really liked what you said about the standard you walk past is the standard that you accept, because I think that that's very true, and it definitely given me a lot of food for thought, and especially in the way how I then go about role modeling for juniors and for medical students and other people around me. Quick question. You were saying if we flip it on its head to change and change the culture, stress will reduce and this will then impact on patient safety. And you mentioned some studies that were done. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on those studies about how changing like the culture and the way things are done, how that does impact patient safety.
Yeah, so the big paper, the famous paper around incivility is Horath et al. I think it was Harvard Business Review, about 2013, something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's the paper where a lot of these facts come from. And basically what they show is that these behaviors create less effective clinicians who, by definition of these behaviors, provide poorer care. And that a bit like, you know, when you see those diagrams at the moment of the way wearing a mask and social distancing works, and it's not just like you and that person, but they kind of spread out. And that's the thing, these behaviors, this culture affects more than just the person it's happening to. So if you, as a pediatric bully, call me an orthopedic moron and a knuckle dragger and accuse me of being a bad doctor and blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. That behavior doesn't just affect me. It will affect everyone in the room and everyone I interact with. So allowing for that sort of thing, you suddenly find that a single behavior has a much wider reaching impact. Therefore, a better culture makes it significantly better. Whereas if you think that if we change it around and we have a culture that is more focused on, and I know it's a bit trite, but kind of being kind and well-being, and the key word often is respect, the people who give respect tend to have a feeling of greater autonomy. They tend to feel more competent, and they tend to have greater job satisfaction, life satisfaction. And the people who receive that respect also feel like they have more autonomy, are more competent, and it's a weird word to hear in science, but it's true, they literally feel happier. And again, all of these things that feel so qualitative, when you combine them with the quantitative data we have, all lead to increased patient care. And again, to flip it on its head again, if you like, when you look at things like mid-staffs, when you look at all of the big hospital headline-making reviews, every single one of them, they cite a toxic culture. If you look at the Patterson review, if you look at all these things, if you look at Leicester and Bawagaba, they all cite a toxic culture, because culture is defined, there's loads of, you know, academic definitions, but I always liked it as it's the force field you walk through and you suddenly go, oh, I'm in that place, that space. It's the way we do things, right? And if you can change it, and the way we do things becomes about a flattened hierarchy, respect, a learning culture, all those sort of things, again, your patients do better. You make less errors, and more than that, you do your actual job better. So you go from making mistakes to being better at your job. And most of the changes that I espouse, I express, are free. They don't cost any money. They take a certain amount of time. And it's worth investing that little bit of time to massively increase the way we can care for our patients and the way we can not only care for our patients, but work together as a team. I mean, one of my favorite pieces of work was actually by the All Blacks rugby team, and they have something called their no asshole rule. And they have famously refused to bring world-class rugby players onto their team because they recognize that their behaviors will be detrimental to the overall outcomes, even though individually they're a rock star. You know, in a more healthcare environment, the equivalent of that would be a paper that was in the BMJ kind of quality safety. And what they did was they had a simulated operative crisis. And they had someone simulate being a polite surgeon and someone simulate being an asshole. And they monitored the anaesthetist's performance. And when the surgeon was polite and respectful, so they weren't lovey-dovey, it was a crisis, right? It wasn't like they were like, if you wouldn't mind, could you please consider maybe giving some inodropes perhaps? They were just polite and respectful. 91.2% of the anaesthetists performed to the expected level of an anaesthetist in an operative crisis. So about 91%. That number was more like 63% with the rude surgeon, right? And what's interesting is the anaesthetists self-reported that they thought they'd done the same. So the anaesthetists who were dealing with the rude person had no idea that their performance had dropped by 30% in a crisis. They thought they were smashing it. And part of that is because we don't like to think of ourselves as victims or so easily, you know, changed. And also, a lot of these behaviors are normalized. So I'm sure you've been in A&E when people have been shouting at one another and swearing, and I'm going to call my consultant, and well, you're just an ST1. And I'm sure if I said, do you think because of that your whole day was worse, your patient care was worse? And most people are going, no, it's just A&E doing their thing. But we know that that's not the case. We know that from that intervention, from that thing that happened in your peripheral vision, you were a less good doctor. And we know that to be true. It's like all these things. The debate needs to end. We know these behaviors affect patient care. We just need to accept it and move on to the next stage, which is doing something about it. And again, if you look at the drink driving conversations, and there's some fascinating media and stuff out there from, you know, the 60s and 70s, you would literally hear people say, look, I've been drinking and driving my whole life and I've never had a crash. But I guess I've heard of people crashing when they're drunk. It makes a kind of sense to me, because we're not yet at that point where people are willing to just go, yeah, look, I just need to stop it. It's just harmful. We're getting there, but people still think that it's okay. And again, it's because those discussions need to be had, because people don't yet understand that there is a difference between feedback and constructive criticism and being a bully. And you can do one without doing the other. I can tell you that you have done a bad job and not be a bully. I can give you an unfortunate experience at ARCP and not undermine you. It is a very different thing, but those conversations need to be had, because of course that's not how most of our senior colleagues and most of us up until very recently were trained. So this isn't just consultants, this is everyone in hospital, because everyone in hospital and primary care has experienced this. So there are ST3s who are, you know, telling their F1s that they're there to be seen and not heard, and women can't be surgeons, because they don't know any better. That's what they were told, that's what they heard. And that, I'm paraphrasing, but Maya Angelou says, no one can expect you to do better than what you know, but once you know better, you need to do better. Well, we know better now. So we now, to improve our patient care, have to do better. And that requires a culture change, because otherwise we're going to keep making mistakes that we don't even realize we're making.
Thank you. Yeah. So we've just had a couple of questions come through on the chat. So someone has said that in a previous trust where they were working, they felt harassed And so what would be your advice for avoiding it in future places that they work at? And then the other question that was posted was where there is a locum doctor who's coming in and is bullying or harassing, how would you approach them and have that discussion?
Again, there's nuance, and this is the bit that's difficult. Firstly, I am a big believer in the Vanderbilt cup of coffee conversation, because I do believe that, well, I know that there have been times throughout my career where I've been that guy. And I would hope that someone would just come up to me and go, can we have a chat? Because, you know, glass houses and all that. However, if you don't feel that you're in a position to have that first conversation, for whatever reason, power, the dynamic, the culture there is just one of like, keep your head down. Everywhere has a freedom to speak up guardian. They are arm's length. They have a whole lot of power and backing, and you can be completely anonymous. So you can go to them, and you might be working at a relatively famous pediatric hospital in central London near Russell Square, and you might want to raise concerns about something there that you might not feel you can, because everyone there is a rock star, everyone there is world famous, everyone there is on your ARCP panel and your MD supervisor and. So you can go to your freedom to speak up guardian and say, these are the things I've experienced, this is how it's made me feel, I would like you to raise these issues, but I don't want them to know where it came from, and I want you to wait until I've left the job. And you can have that conversation, and that's okay. Again, it all very much depends on the nuance of the experience you're having, about whether you feel you can approach it or whether you'd like someone else to approach it. There's some fascinating stuff about what to do in the moment, and whether you should do it in the moment or whether you should wait until the time has passed. And again, only you know that. Whether you feel like you can challenge those behaviors, whether you actually feel it would be better to let tempers settle and then have that cup of coffee. There's a couple of papers whose references I can't remember now, talking about the use of humor as an intervention. So you see someone being shouted at in a corridor and you go, crikey, where's the fire? I mean, I could hear you the other side of the hospital. Anyway, in terms of a locum, again, as a locum myself, because I'm doing my PhD, so at the moment, that's how I pay the bills, I would, again, espouse the same approach. Interestingly, the power dynamic with locums is fascinating, because, of course, on one hand, they might feel, you might feel, well, I can't touch them, right? They're not a trainee, they're not in my chain of command. But actually, the flip of that is, well, they're a locum, they're an employee. If you challenge them politely, respectfully, you have that cup of coffee, or you get someone else to have that conversation with their line manager, they won't get hired again. And it's the thing that's fascinating. A couple of years ago, someone said to me, you do realize, I was part of a conversation around, it was maybe sexual harassment, and we were trying to unpack, myself and the other trainee, whether or not it was sexual harassment. And I spoke to a friend of mine who works at NHS employers and said, off the record, what would happen if? And they were like, well, if you went to HR, because the consultant is a service provision doctor, they have a contract with that hospital, HR would send them home like that day on gardening leave till there was an investigation. They can't not. And you're like, oh yeah, like, oh. So again, if I was that locum, I would hope that someone would have that cup of coffee with me, maybe not that person, maybe someone else, and just say, look, I'm not sure if you're aware, but yesterday you said this or you did this, and this is how you made someone feel, and what's your experience? And I might go, well, you don't know, you don't understand, they were rude to me. And they go, yeah, okay, well, I can have that conversation with them as well, but consider yourself fed back to, do with this information what you want, but in this hospital, we don't bully, we don't make sexist jokes. It is not a thing we do. I'd really rather not have to have this conversation again. We all make mistakes, but consider yourself told. If they do it again, that's where you get your escalation. That's where you have to start doing something about it. There are certain things that I feel like probably are a one strike and you're out, but that's much more nuanced, and they tend to be very obvious, right? If the locum grabs your backside and says something awful, I feel like that's not a misunderstanding or a slip of the tongue. That's out and out unacceptable. And again, whether you have that conversation with them or whether you escalate it to their line manager is very much a personal call and a personal choice. But both require a nuanced approach. The other thing that's difficult, and it refers very much to that question about, what do I do in my next place, is the acceptance we all have to have that though we can introduce zero tolerance for certain things, changing culture takes time, and medics hate that. We're like, well, there's new guidelines that say that these things shouldn't happen anymore, so now if they're happening, well, that's against the rules and everyone should be fired. But actually changing culture is about changing intrinsic beliefs. It means asking people to lose something often, whether that's power or prestige or just an understanding of the status quo. So we can say, look, we have a zero tolerance for racism. Yeah, fine. And yet I am still having conversations with people because they don't understand why their behavior is unacceptable. Ergo, they're like, yeah, absolutely, I have a zero tolerance for racism. There is no debate. There is no place for racism in the NHS. But what I said yesterday wasn't racist, so I don't see why we have a problem. And that's the point, is you still have to incrementally, slowly change culture, because you are literally changing a belief system, which is very different to, well, anything else. Remembering that there is good evidence that doctors ignore level 1 evidence that doesn't fit with their beliefs. So I'm sure you work with consultants who ignore guidelines because they're like, well, in my experience. And that's the point, is we're going to turn around and go, we know that these things harm people, so we need to change completely the way we do things. And people will go, why? I had one boss use a great metaphor. He goes, it's like telling me that wearing brown shoes harms patients. Like, it seems abstract to me. I've done it my whole life. All my colleagues do it, and no one's ever told me before that it's a problem. And now you're telling me I have to buy a whole new wardrobe because you say so. That's what it feels like to some people. And so it takes time to convince people that this very hard endpoint, these behaviors kill and harm patients and staff, are related to things they seem as quite wishy-washy. Like the difference between me saying, so Merit, when are you going to have kids? Versus, so Merit, as your supervisor, if you want to have any conversations around career planning, less than full-time training, or really anything you have, I know for some people, family planning is a concern. If you want to come to me around those conversations, I'm happy to support you. If not, if you don't feel comfortable talking to me, I have colleagues who are willing to have those conversations too. They're both the same conversation coming often from the same place, which is very benign, but one is illegal and one is great training. And having that conversation with someone, they go, no, but they're the same thing. Just one took me 2 seconds and one is a bit wishy-washy. And you're like, no, but they're not the same thing. And it's the same as the where are you from argument. It's the same as all of that stuff. It takes time to change people's viewpoint because it's a core value that we're asking them to just tweak, not change, just tweak.
Thank you. I think those are very great illustrations, and you answered the question so well. So I don't think we have any more questions on the chat. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all the effort that you put into it, and we really are so grateful. And thank you for ending our Patient Safety Week with such a great few take-home messages that I think we'll all be reflecting on from here.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. All right, and the resources that Simon gave me are up already on the learning pack. So if anyone else wants to have a look at those, like, more than welcome to. Okay, thank you so much, Simon.